welcome back to Charbagh at the Z Jaipur Literature Festival. It's a really good crowd for a post-prandial session, so thanks again for packing up the seats. On stage, we already have with us Nicholas Shakespeare, Isabella Tree, Robyn Davidson, Cheryl, and William Dalrymple. Please welcome them all. This is Footloose on travel writing, its relevance in the Google Maps era, and it'll be steered by William. William, as all of you know, writer of many wonderful books, winner of several awards, and co-director of this festival. And it's been an amazing festival so far, and thanks, William, for everything you've done to put together this amazing lineup. Over to you.
Welcome to our annual travel writing slot. Travel writing is, I think, the only form of literature, apart from the epic poem, to appear quite independently in almost every culture in the world. Travel writing is the very origins of human writing. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the wanderings of the patriarchs of the Old Testament, the wanderings of the Pandavas in the Mahabharata. These are some of the most foundational stories in literature. Travel writing appears independently with Marco Polo and Gerald of Wales in Europe, with the great Chinese Buddhist travelers, Fa Hsien and Huan Shang, coming from China down to see the dying flames of Buddhism in India. You find it in the Arab world with Ibn Jubayr and Ibn Battuta. You find it in Japan. It turns up everywhere because it speaks to something very elemental in human experience. This experience of going on a journey, learning things, and the natural arc of a journey from A to B gives the arc of a story. And it seems to be something very fundamental in our humanity to want to talk about our traveling. And the travel book has evolved and changed with each successive generation. From the early travels of the early literature we're talking about, like Gilgamesh, through voyages of merchants like Marco Polo, collecting data about trade, through the colonial travel book, Alexander Burns going to Bukhara when actually acting as an agent of British imperialism and writing reports for the intelligence services of the day. Later British imperial travel writing, telling people where the bauxite mines were in northern Uganda or southern Nigeria. And then by the 1930s, a feeling that the world had already been traveled. And the writers of the 1930s, like Robert Byron, or Evelyn Waugh, or Aldous Huxley, reinventing the travel book as an ironic, more conversational thing full of dialogue, not attempting to give empirical information about untold tracts of land, but instead seeking to amuse the reader. And this, in a sense, is the direction that the travel book has gone ever since. And then reinvented again in the 1970s by people like Paul Theroux, Bruce Chatwin, who Nicholas is going to read about, Patrick Leigh Fermor, as a high literary mode. And we're going to open today with Robyn reading the introduction to her wonderful anthology of travel literature. We're just going to go through, each of us reading for 5-6 minutes, and then going to engage in some of the issues that come out of the readings before throwing it open to you guys. So Robyn, do you want to?
Sure. Hello everyone, thanks for coming. Can you hear me first of all?
Yes.
It's okay? This is an introduction to the Picador Book of Journeys. It's an anthology that earned me about 2 6 halfpenny and took me a year to complete, but it was a wonderful year in the British Library. I did get into a bit of strife for it, for reasons that might become apparent in the introduction. Shortly after its publication in 1980, I was surprised to learn that I had written a travel book. I knew little about literary genre then, but felt an instinctive recoil, as if my intentions had been misunderstood. I had, indeed, walked alone through the deserts of my country, and I had used camels to carry my gear, which was a pragmatic solution to lack of cash. But the geographical distances and the means by which I covered them were not, I thought, the important thing. The book's success had bizarre and unexpected consequences. Firstly, magazine editors and tour companies offered to send me to holiday destinations in order to describe them to people back home who might wish to vacation there, but who, it seemed, wished to experience my experience before they felt confident enough to experience their own. Secondly, publishers pressed me to produce another book as similar as possible to the first. But the journey had been the unique outcome of singular causes. That was the point. To seek to repeat it would be to render my own life kitsch. But once the world sticks a label on you, it takes great effort to resist conforming to it. Reality takes on the shape of a fish trap, and if you are not constantly vigilant, down the funnel you go. 10 years after Tracks was published, I yielded. I went to India and lived with nomads. My intention was genuine enough. I was interested in transhumance. That's the nomadic taking of animals on migration for food. And I did want to write something resembling ethnography. I would select one group, live with them over a long period of time, and study them in isolation from their wider context. When it came time to write it all up, I would edit myself out of the account. That intention was rendered ludicrous from the word go. There is no such thing as a completely disinterested observer, just as there is no such thing as a community isolated from the greater society in which it is embedded. I also carried my own time with me, post-industrial time. I could get into a jeep and in a few hours be at a telephone booth or in a large town. A journey that would take my companions weeks and involve them in many physical hardships. It was not possible for me to live with them in the way I had envisaged because I embodied that other version of time. Both the experience and the attempt to describe it honestly led me to feel that the accepted models of travel writing were somehow compromised. I found I could not pass that section of bookshops without feeling obscure irritation. Nor was I alone in this aversion. There were grumblings of denial from writers you would think represent the very center of the genre, Bruce Chatwin, for example, or Paul Theroux. Even Claude Lévi-Strauss, in his arresting introduction to Triste Tropique, confessed to disliking travel books before writing one that is literature of the highest order. To the best of my knowledge, no other genre suffered this weird allergy to itself. And yet, the vast piles of books written by people who leave home that I have devoured during 50 years of literate life have given me, for the most part, deep pleasure, a seeming contradiction which begs the question, what is travel writing and who gets to say so? All taxonomies are fuzzy sets, that is, boundaries imposed on something that is really a continuum, and in these postmodern days of genre bending, they are getting ever fuzzier. Literary borders are permeable, books migrate. But this tendency to escape standard classification is countered by a more powerful restraining force, as if ambivalence, that is, the space in which we can make up our own minds, is antithetical to the laws of the marketplace. Readers, or rather buyers, are encouraged to use the travel section much as tourists are encouraged to experience holiday destinations, herded along the usual routes, all wayward peregrinations discouraged. Take a spin around that section of a bookshop and you could be forgiven for thinking that the genre is so capacious as to lack meaning. Maps, tourist guides, yachting almanacs, photo essays, rock climbing manuals, a few hoary classics, and shelves of contemporary travelogues, many of them commissioned, published, and written with the intention of satisfying a market. It's not that such books don't deserve a place there, it's that they have come to represent the genre as it is generally conceived, that is, a literature to accommodate a longing for the exotic in an increasingly homogenized and trivialized world. Now, I could go on, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
I'd like to read from a biography I wrote of Bruce Chatwin, who was a friend of Robyn's and mine and an inspiration to writers like William and many others of my generation. Chatwin had Evelyn Waugh's delicious gift for seeing people as funny. His most common word in conversation, noticed the Australian novelist Murray Bale, was mad. It was a description of honour. He didn't like ordinary people, he wanted them extraordinary. Everyone's quite mad, he would say, speaking in italics with bulging eyes. He could give others the same impression. There was something inhuman about him when he got excited, said Sybil Bedford. A mad horse, large eyes with lots of white. The performance was physical. As he watched his audience come forward on their chairs, affirming him, he grew, and so did his stories. He went straight into a performance, says his friend Jonathan Hope. He'd sit bolt upright, ramrod back, his eyes popping, and roar off in fourth gear on his idée fixe of that week or hour. He reminded Hope of Danny Kaye, a Chatwin favourite, who was able to convince an audience entirely by phonetics that he was speaking in Hungarian. Hope could seldom follow Chatwin's stories to their conclusion, but he would conjure up incredible images, evening in the Atlas Mountains, the sky, an exquisite cerulean blue, the stars coming out one by one, and the wonderful sang de boeuf of the North African desert. Sometimes it would get so exhausting that I'd say, could you just show me a photograph? He rehearsed his stories like Churchill muttering in the bath, says Chatwin's wife, Elizabeth. He was always playing a kind of role. You could see him cooking up how he was going to do it. He was so excited when he got to someone's house. He'd drive up, slam on the brakes, jump out, and rush into the house, and I'd have to turn the engine off and shut the car door. Elizabeth Chatwin did not believe he intended anyone necessarily to believe his stories, but if they did, he went further. Chatwin was a storyteller first, but not until the last third of his life did he write the stories down. I've always loved telling stories, he told Colin Thubron. It's telling stories for what it's worth. Everyone says, are you writing a novel? No, I'm writing a story, and I do rather insist that things must be called stories. That seems to me to be what they are. I don't quite know the meaning of the word novel. Stories were Chatwin's central obsession, digging for them, bringing them to the surface, sharing them. He was looking for stories the world could give him and that he could embellish, says Salman Rushdie, who travelled with him through Central Australia. He didn't give a damn whether they were true or not, only whether they were good. Chatwin was very theatrical, but he was also deeply serious. His stories concealed as much as they revealed, and he hid inside them. He talked as he wrote to keep something at bay, with an intensity to convince whoever was listening or reading that his dragons were not peculiar to him. He told his stories right to the last, going up to bed, stopping on each step of the stair for 5 minutes, going out to the car, as he drove off, leaning out of the window, till the moment he died. In this, he shared the malleability of all-knowing Proteus, eluding questions by changing into a lion, a serpent, a fire. His whole life was spent transforming, says the actor and theatre director Peter Eyre. As long as he was talking, he could not be questioned. As with a child, he could invoke in his audience a tenderness towards something easily shattered. He was very scared, says Rushdie. He was telling stories to keep the jungle beast away, the false saber-tooth, whatever it is. Rushdie had no doubt what this beast was. The beast is the truth about himself. The great truth he's keeping away is who he is. Say almost anything of Bruce Chatwin, and the opposite is also true. There seem to be as many Bruce Chatwins as people he met. I sometimes think he wasn't a person, he was a scrum says the art critic Robert Hughes. I think I hardly knew him, there were so many of him, says Sheila Chandler. The American artist Michel Laporte likened him to a mirror. Often people talk about him and end up talking about themselves. Something in him spoke to an impulse, a fear that is universal, says his American editor, Elizabeth Sifton. The beast is the truth about ourselves for each of us. Perhaps this accounts for why so many people feel proprietorial about him. According to Francis Wyndham, it's a rare person who remains neutral. People feel some attitude has to be taken about Bruce, as if you define yourself by how you react to him. Rushdie says, you have to agree or disagree. Everything he did very noisily, and that creates a response. Anthony Pearl recorded in his diary after watching On the Black Hill on television, I always feel there was something a bit phony about Chatwin. Andrew Harvey, reviewing the songlines in the New York Times, spoke for a younger audience. Nearly every writer of my generation in England has wanted, at some point, to be Bruce Chatwin. Wanted, like him, to talk of Fez or Firdausi, Nigeria and Nuristan with equal authority. Wanted to be talked about, as he is, with raucous envy. Wanted above all to have written his books. He was, wrote Harvey, a writer no one who cares for literature can afford not to read. Bruce's endeavour might seem to be old-fashioned, uniting him to the earliest Far-Side storytellers, but there's something prescient in his insistence that everything is linked. He introduces us to people and to texts we would not otherwise have encountered. He makes the world tidier, simpler, more exciting, a place to sample, at ease with anybody. His vision is both aristocrat and populist, and it is adventurous. In some ways, he was a tremendous snob, but he was not a climber. What is compelling about Bruce Chatwin is easily lost in a din of bright lights and colours, incessant chatter, and a crowded address book where Jackie Onassis is listed next to an oryx herder. He is so noisy that you cannot hear him, so good-looking that you cannot see him. His work so restrained and cool that you cannot feel him. His fastidiousness as a disguise, says Rushdie, and oddly, that disguise is what most readers would think of Bruce. They refer to the characteristics of the prose, where the work is transparent, unencumbered, and deceivingly clear. His life is deliberately opaque. We know nothing about him at the book's end, Alistair Reid grumbled in the New Yorker Review when reviewing In Patagonia. In fact, Bruce himself is more mysterious and subtle than anything he wrote.
I was part of that generation of Andrew Harvey who wanted to be Bruce Chatwin. I met him when I'd just come back from writing from the journey which became In Xanadu. And by that stage I knew almost every word he'd written by heart, and suddenly he turned up at a lunch party I'd been invited to. And for all the kind of dazzling qualities, he was also extremely generous. I was a squitty undergraduate trying to write a book, and he just took a huge interest and wanted to know where I'd been, wanted to know all about Xanadu, about the tiles, the colour of the tiles, and was asking endless questions. And anyway, it was reading In Patagonia that I think really made me want to write a travel book. And those of you who don't know his work or haven't read In Patagonia have got a great treat. It's one of the most clipped and gorgeously written and polished works of prose from the end of the last century, certainly in non-fiction. And as Andrew Harvey said, it influenced hundreds of books. Lots and lots of people wrote books that had echoes of In Patagonia. This passage I'm going to read now is not at all in any sort of homage to Chatwin. It's a stationary book written about Delhi called City of Jinns, 22 years old now, and records a city which no longer exists in many ways. The City of Jinns has gone under malls and concrete and plate glass windows and PVR cinemas. And it's now, in many ways, a sort of quaint historical record, like one of those black and white photographs that shows old-fashioned cars with blowhorns and which are now just merely signs of a vanished world. But even when I was writing it, there was another Delhi before that which had vanished, which was the old Delhi of the Mughals, this incredibly attractive, poetic, elegant, late Mughal society which grew up in the old city with its elaborate etiquette, with its code of poetry which crossed class divides, and which seemed to be so very different from the Punjabi, modern, post-partition Delhi which I was living in. And the descriptions of Delhi having the most beautiful Urdu, having the most refined etiquette, the way how to pass upon and all this sort of thing, was something that was just clearly not there in 1991 when I was writing this book. And I went to Karachi to find the man who it turned out was still alive. I'd assumed that he died decades earlier, Ahmed Ali, who wrote a fabulous book, arguably the great Delhi novel, no, I think unquestionably the great Delhi novel, called Twilight in Delhi. And he was a victim of partition and had found himself unhappily in Karachi, in a country he'd never wanted to exist, forgotten and unpublished. And thanks to David Davidar, who somehow had a contact for him, I ended up flying to Karachi to seek him out. Ahmed Ali was there to meet us. He wore severe black-rimmed glasses, above which sprouted a pair of thin grey eyebrows. He slurred his consonants and had the slightly limp wrist and effete manner of one who modelled himself on a Bloomsbury original. For a man once seen as a bulwark of a champion of Delhi's culture, a bulwark of Eastern civilization against the seepage of Western influence, Ahmed Ali now cut an unexpectedly English figure. With his clipped accent and tweed jacket and old leather elbow patches, he could have passed off successfully as a clubland character in a Noel Coward play. But despite his comfortable, well-to-do appearance, Ahmed Ali was an angry man. Over the hours I spent with him, he spluttered and spat like a well-warmed frying pan. The first occasion was when I inadvertently mentioned that he was now a citizen of Pakistan. "Poppycock, balder duck, dash," he said. "I was always against Jinnah, never had any interest in Pakistan." "Steady on," said his friend Shanul Haq. "The devil," said Ali. "Pakistan's not a country, never was, it's a damned hodgepodge. It's not your country or my country," he was shouting at Shanul Haq now. "It's a country of a damned bunch of feudal lords, robbers, bloody murderers, kidnappers." The outburst spluttered out into silence. "But," I ventured, "didn't you opt for Pakistan? Couldn't you have stayed in Delhi had you wanted to?" There was another explosion. "I opted for Pakistan, I did not. I was the visiting professor in Nanking when the blasted partition took place. The bloody swine of Hindus wouldn't let me go home, so..." "What do you mean?" "I went and saw the Indian ambassador in Peking. Bloody swine said I couldn't return, said it was a question of Hindu against Muslim, and there was nothing he could do. I was caught in China and had nowhere to go." "Careful," said Shanul Haq, seeing the state his friend had worked himself up into. "So how did you end up in Karachi?" I said. "When my salary in Nanking was stopped, I found my way to some friends in Hong Kong. They put me on an amphibious boat to Karachi. Where else could I have gone if I couldn't go back to Delhi?" Ali had ceased to quiver with rage and was now merely very cross. "I never opted for Pakistan," he said, gradually regaining his poise. "The civilization that I belong to, the civilization of Delhi, came into being through the mingling of two different cultures, Hindu and Muslim. That civilization flourished for 1,000 years undisturbed until certain people came along and denied that that great mingling had ever taken place." "Views like that can hardly have made you very popular here," I said. "They never accepted me in Pakistan, damn it. I've been weeded out. They don't publish my books, they've deleted my name. When copies of Twilight in Delhi arrived at the Karachi customs from India, they sent them back, said that the book was about the forbidden city across the border. They implied that the culture was foreign and subversive. In that case, I said, couldn't you go back to Delhi? Couldn't you reapply for Indian citizenship? Now, no country is my country, said Ali. Delhi is dead. The city I knew that was, the language, the culture, everything I knew is finished. It's true, said Shah al-Haq. I went back 13 years after partition. Already everything was very different. I stayed in a new hotel, the Ambassador, which I only later realized had been built on top of a graveyard where several of my friends were buried. In my mohalla, everyone knew me, but suddenly I was a stranger. My Haveli was split into 10 parts and occupied by Punjabis. My wife's house had become a temple. Delhi was no longer the abode of the Delhiwala. Even the walls had changed. It was very depressing. Before partition, said Ali, it was a unique city. Although it was very poor, it preserved its high culture. That culture filtered down even to the streets. Even the milk one could quote Mir and Dag. The prostitutes could sing Persian songs and recite Hafiz. They may not have been able to read and write, but they could remember the poets. And the language, said Shah al-Haq. The language. You cannot conceive how chaste our Delhi Urdu was. And how rich, said Ali. Every mahalla had its own expressions. The language used by our ladies was quite different from that used by the men. Now the language has shrunk. So many words are lost. We talked for an hour about the Delhi of their childhood and youth. We talked of the eunuchs and the Sufis and the poets and the pigeons, of monsoon picnics in Meroli and the jinn who fell in love with Ahmed Ali's aunt. We talked of the sweetmeat shops which stayed open until 3 in the morning, the sorcerers who could cast spells over whole mahallas, the possessed woman who used to run vertically up the Zanana walls, and the miraculous cures effected by Hakim Ajmal Khan. The two old men swam together through great oceans of nostalgia before finally coming ashore on a strand of melancholy. But all of that is no more, said Ali. All that made Delhi special has been uprooted and dispersed. Now it is a carcass without a soul, said Shah al-Haq. I am a fossil, said Ali, and Shah al-Haq is on his way to becoming a fossil. But nevertheless, I insisted, if you both love Delhi so much, wouldn't you like to see it one more time? I will never see that town again, said Ali. Once I was invited to give some lectures in Australia. There was a mechanical fault, and the plane was diverted to Delhi. The plane landed, but I refused to get out. I said, I'm not getting out. I don't have to. You call your damn chairman. But I'm not putting one foot on that soil which once was mine, and which now has been desecrated. They got the entire staff of the airport to get me out, but I didn't move. How could I? How could I revisit that which once was mine and now was no longer mine? When they asked why I was behaving as I was, I simply sat in my seat and quoted Mir Taki Mir at them. What matters it, O breeze, if now has come the spring, when I have lost them both, the garden and my nest. What happened, I asked. The swine were all Punjabis, said Ali. Tell you the truth, I don't think they understood a bloody word I said.
So this is from my book, The Living Goddess, which came out 2 days ago. It's about a tradition in Nepal, in the Kathmandu Valley, where people worship young girls from between the age of 2 and 11 as emanations of the great universal mother goddess. So this is the first time I was able to meet one of these goddesses in the flesh and actually set eyes on her and kneel at her feet. In a tiny room with the same sky blue walls and earthen floor, the little goddess was sitting bolt upright on her throne against a backrest of green and silver nagas, their scaly heads conjoined in a crown hovering above her head. Her eyes flashed up as she watched me enter. She was no more than 6 years old. Her hair was combed tightly into a bun and tied with a red ribbon on top of her head. Thick lines of collyrium exaggerated her eyes and elongated them to her temples. A clot of reddened rice from the morning's puja clung to the center of her forehead. Hanging around her neck over a scarlet jersey was a silver amulet box, the yantramala of Talaju. Her bare feet, protruding beneath a scarlet skirt of satin brocade, rested expectantly in an offering tray. She was clutching the sides of her throne like the commander of a starship. Her expression, despite the freshness of her face and the adorable plumpness of her cheeks, deadly serious. I found myself smiling impulsively at her as I entered the room. But, just like the Kumari in Kathmandu, the gorgeous eyes, recalling me to respectfulness, returned an uncompromising glare. Uncertainly, I ventured forward towards the living goddess's throne, and kneeling on the rice mat, bowed my head to her tiny feet. The little goddess reacted with automatic reflexes, accepting my offering with barely a glimmer of interest and delicately placing it to one side. Her timing and coordination seemed as natural as her self-assurance. Though she was no older than most children in their first year of primary school, this was a routine she had enacted 1,000 times before. I thought of my daughter, the same age, her fumbling, plump little fingers still struggling to get to grips with a button, her shyness so acute that she hid behind my legs at the sight of a stranger. The Kumari dipped her fingers into a dish at her side. As I craned forward to receive my tikka, the cold, wet touch of vermilion paste from her fingertips sent a tiny shockwave across my forehead. Like a queen knighting her subject, she handed me some petals to place on my head, and then an apple, prasad, which I touched to my forehead by way of thanks, before rocking back on my heels and struggling to my feet. Our ritual exchange was over. In the days following, I looked back on this encounter and wondered why it had affected me when so little, in fact, seemed to have happened. Rather than receding in my memory, the moment seemed to grow with significance. There had been the theatrical thrill of finding myself in the immediate presence of a living goddess, of course, something I had never expected. But the encounter had aroused subtler emotions too, reactions that were connected not so much with anything the living goddess herself had done, but with my part in the performance. Finding myself on my knees for the first time since my early school days, about 20 years ago, had taken me by surprise. The physical feeling of the ground beneath me, my head lower than a child's, had unexpected implications. It was a simple gesture, but it had profound psychological impact. It was a surrendering of the ego, a letting go of adult assumptions of superiority and control. To Nehwaz, this symbolic prostration also crucially provided a counterbalance to male dominance. The practice of Kumari Puja was mirrored in every Nehwa household whenever there was a big event, like a birth or marriage or some other important life cycle ritual. Whatever the occasion, worshipping a little girl was one of the most powerful ways of bringing the goddess into every home and invoking her blessings. It was also a reminder to everyone in society, but particularly men, of the expected standard of behavior towards women and young girls. Kneeling was more than an act of reverence, it changed the person doing it. It manifested a willingness in a person to open up to a source of wisdom and experience higher than their own. It imbued a sense of humility. I had knelt at the feet of a child, and in doing so I realized I had, in some way, become a child again myself. There seemed no better position from which to approach the deeper aspects of the tradition. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for coming today. It's such an honor to read my work so far from home. I'm going to read to you from my book, Wild, which is a memoir of the 1,100-mile or 1,700-kilometer hike I took on what's called the Pacific Crest Trail. The PCT runs from the U.S.-Mexican border in Southern California through the states of California, Oregon, and Washington up to the Canadian border. It's about 2,600 miles long, and I hiked about 1,100 miles of that. I did the hike solo in the summer of 1995 when I was 26. And when I took the hike, I was a writer, but I'd never imagined that I would write about the experience. And I did write about it, about 13 or 14 years later, and that's how Wild came to be. I'm going to read to you just a few pages from the very opening of the book. It's the prologue, and it's about 6 weeks into my hike at this point, and something bad happened. The trees were tall, but I was taller, standing above them on a steep mountain slope in Northern California. Moments before, I'd removed my hiking boots, and the left one had fallen into those trees, first catapulting into the air when my enormous backpack toppled onto it, then skittering across the gravelly trail and flying over the edge. It bounced off a rocky outcropping several feet beneath me before disappearing into the forest canopy below. Impossible to retrieve. I let out a stunned gasp, though I'd been in the wilderness 38 days by then, and I'd come to know that anything could happen and that everything would. But that doesn't mean I wasn't shocked when it did. My boot was gone, actually gone. I clutched its mate to my chest like a baby, though of course it was futile. What is one boot without the other boot? It's nothing. It's useless, an orphan forevermore, and I could take no mercy on it. It was a big lug of a thing, of genuine heft, a brown leather Reichley boot with a red lace and silver metal fasts. I lifted it high and threw it with all my might and watched it fall into the lush trees and out of my life. I was alone. I was barefoot. I was 26 years old and an orphan too, an actual stray a stranger had observed a couple of weeks before when I'd told him my name and explained how very loose I was in the world. My father left my life when I was 6. My mother died when I was 22. In the wake of her death, my stepfather morphed from the person I considered my dad into a man I only occasionally recognized. My 2 siblings scattered in their grief in spite of my efforts to hold us together, until I gave up and scattered too. In the years before I pitched my boot over the edge of that mountain, I'd been pitching myself over the edge too. I'd ranged and roamed and railed from Minnesota to New York to Oregon and all across the West, until at last I found myself bootless in the summer of 1995, not so much loose in the world, but bound to it. It was a world I'd never been to and yet had known was there all along, one I'd staggered to in sorrow and confusion and fear and hope. A world I thought would both make me into the woman I knew I could become and turn me back into the girl I'd once been. A world that measured 2 feet wide and 2,663 miles long. A world called the Pacific Crest Trail. I'd first heard of it only 7 months before when I was living in Minneapolis, sad and desperate and on the brink of divorcing a man I still loved. I'd been standing in line at an outdoor store waiting to purchase a foldable shovel when I picked up a book called The Pacific Crest Trail, Volume 1, California, from a nearby shelf and read the back cover. The PCT, it said, was a continuous wilderness trail that went from the Mexican border in California to just beyond the Canadian border along the crest of 9 mountain ranges. That distance was 1,000 miles as the crow flies, but the trail was more than double that, traversing the entire length of the states of California, Oregon, and Washington, passing through national parks and wilderness areas, federal and tribal lands, through deserts and mountains and rainforests, across rivers and highways. I turned the book over and gazed at its front cover, a boulder-strewn lake surrounded by rocky crags against a blue sky, and then placed it back on the shelf paid for my shovel, and left. But later I returned and bought the book. The Pacific Crest Trail wasn't a world to me then. It was an idea, vague and outlandish, full of promise and mystery. Something bloomed inside of me as I traced its jagged line with my finger on a map. I would walk that line, I decided, or at least as much of it as I could in about 100 days. I was living alone in a studio apartment in Minneapolis, separated from my husband, working as a waitress, as low and mixed up as I'd ever been in my life. Each day I felt as if I were looking up from the bottom of a deep well. But from that well, I set about becoming a solo wilderness trekker. And why not? I'd been so many things already. A loving wife and an adulteress, a beloved daughter who now spent holidays alone, an ambitious overachiever and aspiring writer who hopped from one meaningless job to the next while dabbling dangerously with drugs and sleeping with too many men. I was the granddaughter of a Pennsylvania coal miner, the daughter of a steelworker turned salesman. After my parents split up, I lived with my mother, brother, and sister in apartment complexes for single mothers and their kids. As a teen, I lived back to the land style in the Minnesota North Woods in a house that didn't have an indoor toilet or electricity or running water. In spite of this, I'd become a high school cheerleader and homecoming queen. And then I went off to college and became a left-wing feminist campus radical. But a woman who walks alone in the wilderness for 1,100 miles? I'd never been anything like that before. I had nothing to lose by giving it a whirl.
Nicholas, today we have Google Earth, and we can look up any patch of the globe from our laptop. Why do you think the travel book has managed to survive despite, in a sense, the exclusivity of travel has gone? Marco Polo was the only person who'd been to China. No one else had been. Today, everyone can jump on a plane and go tomorrow. And yet the travel book survives and has continued to reinvent itself. Why do you think that's happened? Why is it not dead?
Well, I think Bruce had a certain amount to do with this, in that the convention of 19th century travel is that you go from A to B or Z and describe it in a linear journey and in the time you did it. I think what Chatwin did was he was in a sense a precursor of the internet. He gave you the sense that everything was linked and that there was, as you once told me, he gave you the sense there was a key to everything if only you could find it. And that Western Africa is linked to Brazil, and that we are all linked to each other in some way. And he, in Patagonia, which you cited, one of my favorite books, if you go to Patagonia trying to think of this as a way to help you navigate Patagonia, it's just not that text. It zigzags through time and space. And it's not a linear journey. And I think he allows you, like his successor, Sebald, to just go for a walk in Suffolk, but suddenly peel off into talking about Conrad or about Rembrandt. As a personal reaction to Chatwin, when I'd finished this biography, which took 7 years, and I'd traveled all over the world in his footsteps, I felt I'd been almost sent to transportation for 7 years in his head. And so I wanted to get away from him, and I thought the only place I could escape to was a place he'd never been. And there was only two places he'd never been, Baffin Island and Tasmania. And I thought, great, I'll go to Tasmania, which is a Chatwin-free zone, and I will not have to have his contaminating influence. And so I get to Tasmania, I go for a trek, I fall completely in love with this remote, it's as remote from England as you can get. And I fell in love with this place, I fell in love with a beach house. It was the first time in my life I wanted to settle somewhere. I bought this beach house. My father came out to dissuade me, saying you can't sink all your earnings in a beach house at the end of the world. He turns around in tears in his eyes after doing day, saying I've never been anywhere more beautiful. And then he goes back doing it, he says, I've just found some letters in my mother's basement. I think we have relatives in Tasmania. And I said, what? These letters come from an 18th century appalling person who went out to Australia with the Second Fleet. He ran Sydney, the Rum Corps. He then went to Tasmania and claimed it for England. He's known as the father of Tasmania. I knew nothing of this in my family cupboard, dark closet with these skeletons. And I was incredibly excited. And then I was beginning to research him, and my mother then rang up and said, I think I have relatives in Tasmania. I said, what? She had found the existence of 2 elderly women in the north of Tasmania in their 80s, sisters who lived on the same farm which they had never left. I mean, they made the brothers in On the Black Hill look like frequent flyers. They had never left this 40-acre farm in the north of Tasmania. So I ring the woman up. She bursts into tears. She has a picture of my mother on the wall, me on the wall, and I go and see her. She has once departed from this farm 17 years before to buy a pair of shoes in Launceston, which is about 20 miles south. Otherwise, she's never left that farm. Anyway, I'm almost coming to the end of this. She directs me to a village called Kindred, which is about 4 miles away. She says, you want to go and see that? There's a wonderful churchyard there. I go to this churchyard, and to my amazement and horror, there is a grave to Elizabeth Chatwin, 1860. And I look next to it, and there's a Max Chatwin, and there's about 4 other Chatwins. So I look in the telephone book. There are 133 Chatwins in this town in Tasmania. So I ring up the head of the family, Max Chatwin. He said, oh, well, you should speak to my wife. She's written a book about Chatwin. And I got hold of the book. It's Chatwin, 6 generations in Tasmania. The story goes that his great-great-uncle had jumped ship in the Melbourne Gold Rush and come to Tasmania. There are more Chatwins in Tasmania than anywhere on earth. The point of the story, in getting away from Bruce and everything, I found my own story. And that was a gift he, I think, gave to many people. If you read him, you'll find your own stories in his books. But when you talk to him, he finds out of you your best stories. And I think in escaping him, I found mine. Sorry, wrong way.
Robyn, the passage you read was a little censorious of travel writing. Do you still feel as mixed feelings about the genre as you did that? Because it's kind of, you wrote that at a particular time, I think, which was a moment after those great books were written, 77, Time of Gifts, In Patagonia. And then this flood of imitations and bad travel books.
Yes, I think so.
And there was a period when the sort of travel book went out. It was sort of undoable. But since then, we've had Saketu Mehta's Maxim City, for my money, the best book on India this millennium. The genre continues. I mean, Rana Dasgupta, the book we just relaunched on the front lawns before lunch, is an extraordinary book, and is a great book in the way that In Patagonia is.
I think it's as you said, that the genre is, I mean, at that time it was at a low, you're absolutely right, and I think it is reinventing itself, and very interestingly. I actually posit that idea at the end of the introduction, and that I think one of the very interesting things that is happening and must happen, if you think traditionally, that sort of traditional idea of the genre is that it's about the center looking at the periphery. And now what's starting to happen is the periphery looking at the center. And that puts a whole different skew on the genre and makes it, to me, much more interesting.
Cheryl, do you think you can envisage writing another book like that? I mean, you said specifically it's a specific journey you did at a specific time in relation to you said this. There's a specific journey, but nonetheless, do you feel that you would go off again and hike or do a form of travel book, or have you exhausted your appetite for that sort of book?
Well, I love reading that sort of book, and I love writing that sort of book, but I was really in agreement with some of the things that Robyn was reading about. I didn't realize that I was writing a travel book when I was writing Wild. I'm a literary writer, I'm a novelist, I'm an essayist, and so anything I experience might someday end up in my work. I would never want to take a journey because I got a book contract, because I think that would very much skew my experience. I would do things because I would think, well, this will be good for the book. And so I really think that, yes, I will someday probably write a travel book again, a journey book, but it has to come from an organic place in me. It has to be something I did in my life that I think is worthy of literature, and that there's something that I can bring to the story beyond, look at me, I did something interesting. And I think that's where travel writing can sometimes fail. You know, those of us who teach writing know that who's ever taken a trip thinks that they can write an interesting book, and that's not the case. And so, do you have something to say about that journey? That's the question. And so if I do ever have something to say about the journeys I take, I'll write a book about it. Yeah.
Izzy, I was lucky enough to see various manuscripts, versions of this book in its long, 13-year gestation towards publication, which happened this week.
Yes.
13 years ago.
Yep.
Big round of applause. 13 years of writing. But in the earlier versions, it was, in a sense, more of a travel book than the film. You've taken yourself out a lot.
Yeah.
Why was that?
It started very much in the sort of manner of my previous books, which was a rather sort of conventional, straightforward journey. But I think I was just simply taken by surprise by the subject. I had no idea how rich and deep and difficult it was. So I ended up, rather than making one long trip, going back to Kathmandu repeatedly, 2 or 3 times a year. And then extraordinary things just kept happening, coups and, you know, Maoists and King's Sphinx massacres, royal family massacres. And they were all intimately connected with the subject that I was doing, that I was concentrating on. But I think it was very interesting going back and going deeper into a place, returning to the same place again and again over a period of 10, 13 years. Because you begin to just, you know, uncover the layers. It was...
We've nearly overshot time. We've probably got time for about 2 questions. The microphone's around. Anyone? This gentleman here.
Hi, I want to say by first thing, saying thank you to Isabella. And that's because I grew up in Kathmandu. My mother's from there. And I just picked up your book last night. I'm already 1/3 into the book. And, you know, all of these great memories came flooding back. Right, so it's very special. I think I would rank it alongside Peter Madison's Snow Leopard and...
wow.
Yeah.
It's a great book.
Another one, Into Thin Air by John Krakauer. You know, amazing travel books about Nepal, but I think great pieces of literature as well. So thank you from me, thank you from, I guess, all the entire Nepali diaspora all around the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's a butt coming up.
There's one question. I do have one question. So to quote one of your lines, you said, legends run circles around historical facts, and I know that for a fact myself. So how did you connect the dots? I can't imagine you dreaming them into existence because it feels so authentic. I can almost feel the atmosphere being real.
You're talking about the mythical chapters,
right?
The stories, yes.
Yeah.
A lot of them are taken just from oral tradition. And I heard quite a few different versions, perhaps, of the same myth. These sort of wind through the book because they're relevant to the historical present-day happenings. And so I just wove the oral traditions together and created a story out of them. So it was taking liberties to an extent because I was melding them together.
One more, last question. Lady at the back. No, you, that's right, you in the aisle. Yep.
I haven't read your book. I have a note of dissent, so it's just on the basis of what you read, because if you do a little sociological research, these girls have a terrible time, and they're locked in this little place. You're very lucky you visited as a foreigner, because 10 years ago, only Hindus and upper caste Hindus could visit her. And they're locked up in this room, and the father gets quite a lot of money, all the tips that are left. And I think it's a little naive to say that it's a great feminist thing, because, you know, the greatest amount of prostitutes
Is there a
exported
question, madam? We have-
from Nepal. So I was wondering if you did any sociological research before you wrote the book?
Well, I think, yeah. This is directed at me.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, all my research really comes from the living goddesses themselves, their families, the ex-Kumaris, from all the people who surround the culture she comes from. So I would say that absolutely the reverse is true. There are a lot of rumors around the Kumari, which is one of the reasons I wrote this book. And it's very difficult to dispel those rumors because journalists come in and write very sloppy articles without really getting into the truth of the matter. An ex-Kumari has written a book herself. She's a great sort of defender of the tradition. She's written a book called From Goddess to Mortal, and it's a wonderful book if you want to read more about the conditions of life for them inside the Kumari Palace.
1 more minute. A final question?
A fast question. There's somebody at the back there, right?
Somebody in the back? Yep.
Hello. Do you see a difference between the British tradition of travel books where you have the strong center, the London, and then the periphery, and the American tradition of travel books going back to Mark Twain with Innocents Abroad and A Tramp Abroad, and going through to Paul Theroux and the other modern American travel writers?
Is there a big difference? I was very struck by listening to Cheryl, how it was absolutely wonderful, but it seemed to be very American coming from a Brit. The kind of heart on the sleeve self-analysis. But yes, inevitably, I think you'll find very different traditions of travel writing in different countries. The travel writing of India, thinking of books like Vikram Seth's From Heaven's Lake, In an Antique Land by Amitav Ghosh, Maximum City, Now Capital, has a very coherent flavour of its own, which is very literary. And I think that is very proper, that you will find different national identities reflected in the writing. Do you agree, Georgia?
Yeah, I think that you absolutely see national character reflected in the prose itself.
Yeah.
I would say, if I had to generalize, that American travel writing is closer to memoir in terms of the subjectivity
journey
of
in the South, yeah.
the journey of the South
The
narrative.
three Brits are too tied up in knots to do.
You guys are all too repressed.
But the British Empire was built from people trying to get out of Britain. This vile climate, this very tiny,
Vile food.
congested piece of geography. And in America, you have wonderful geography and climate. And
So you go into your interior of your country and you go into your navels. So.
That's right, that's right.
Anyway, on that happy note, thank you very much. Cheryl Strayed, Isabella Tree,
Thank you.
Nicholas Shakespeare, and Robyn Davidson.
William Dalrymple. Thank you all so much.